So I'm going to prepare this file to load up my final matte painting. The final matte painting res is 2500 by 1556, and typically you can go into these stages after you've reached a point where you've explored what you can do with your animated camera and your animatic. So as we saw in the last animatic, the entire matte painting wasn't really painted wide enough to encompass even the slightest 3D move. So I went ahead and increased the canvas size of my final matte painting, and as a result, in order to use the same camera map cameras in 3D Studio Max, we're going to have to use this tool written by my friend Glenn Cotter at Matworld Digital to calculate the difference. So this camera map render helper allows us to type in our current settings that we were using in the previous animatic, that is the red camera, give it the millimeters, which is 35 millimeters, and tell 3D Studio Max what our canvas size used to be. Now we know our new canvas size, 2500 by 1556. All we got to do is hit calculate, and we'll get the results here at the bottom. So the results here at the bottom tell us that we need a new camera at 28.6267. So what that does is it allows everything to line up exactly the same. Without doing this, the new matte painting would have simply been shrunk down, smaller, in order to fit within that same viewport. It would have appeared that everything was smaller and farther away, the palace would have seemed farther away, and it just wouldn't have had the same composition that we intended. So let's go ahead and start loading up the shaders with the new matte paintings and applying them to all of our objects. And we'll go in here and we'll select that old camera map camera, and let's just call it Sketch, because this is the one that is set for the old canvas size. And in the render dialog box we have the new canvas size. So when we apply the camera map modifiers to all of our objects, everything is going to be applied at the right scale. So now all of our objects have a new relationship to the new camera map, and I'm just projecting the same painting on everything, just the same one painting, no layers as I did in the animatic, just for a quick test. Now, this isn't going to be what we use for the final render, but I just want to make sure that I see how how each pixel is landing on each piece of geometry. So I just shrunk the render down to the same aspect ratio. We'll take a look and see what we see with this newly animated camera. So I'm just going throughout the scene and doing some test renders and making minor modifications, keeping in mind that everything is on one layer from my Photoshop document at this point in time. So painting all refers to the fact that it's just a big flattened painting. Now what I'll do is I'll start loading up some of the separate files, some of the separate layers. So we're going to start with the palace. We'll get just the palace on the card. We'll do this eventually for every other piece of geometry in the scene. But for now, let's start with the palace on a card. So there it is, rendered by itself. And you can see that the card's not big enough on the left or the right. So we still need a little more space on the left. So keep widening it, and then as it gets bigger, we'll give it just going to render every 5 frames again. Let's see what the camera sees. So at the beginning of the shot, we see to the left of that rock there, on the left-hand side, and at the end there was a little space. So I'm going to try and adjust this camera, the animated camera, not the red one, and see if we can get a better frame 1 position for this camera. We want it so that we don't see off to the edge of the painting on that leftmost cliff. And as well, later on we'll try and change it at the end of the shot. We want to try and minimize as much extra painting as possible. So it seems here if we render it frame 1, we're now encompassing, the camera's view is encompassing everything on the left side of frame. Go to frame 100, tweak that a little bit. Watch the bottom right hand side of the frame. What we want to do is move the camera around until we push the very extreme edge of what this painting is giving us. We want to get as much 3D environment out of this painting as we can, but we don't want to go so far. We don't want to cross that edge, that line, so that we have to do extra painting. So I'm just going to add the texture map of these hills back there behind the palace. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the card that the palace is on and duplicate it back behind the palace. We'll just rename it, and we'll apply the appropriate texture map for those hills. This will save me a little time in having to go and create another. Let's take a quick look at a few rendered frames. You can tell that that cliff, that hill I just added is on a plane. It looks a little two-dimensional. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in there and warp this plane enough to mimic the general strokes as to what's going on in the painting. So on the right hand side I can use a soft selection, push it back, push the left hand side back a bit, and then the top as well. Since it is a hilltop, that tilts back away from it. Sense of perspective in those cliffs. Of course, the water and all that foreground stuff isn't going to be seen on this particular piece of geometry, so just go ahead and ignore that. So we can see a little bit of deformation in there as that camera moves around, and that's exactly what I was trying to achieve. So we render it out, and it looks a little bit better. So I'm just going to go over to the left hand side of this piece of geometry and stretch the vertices over so that we see all the texture map. There we go. Now we got the edge of the painting in there. So we filled in that little gap. Let's pull up the last render again. So we still have the gap, but I'm looking for other things to fix here in this animation. So the foreground two cliffs there on the left, they still feel pretty flat. So let's go into the geometry here. I'll show you a few techniques for how I go in and distort these guys with minimal effort, just to try and get a little more parallax out of them. It's fairly similar to what I did back there on the on that last plane with the soft selection. But what I'll do in here is I'll just try to make these all the vertices, I'll squeeze them into a more dense position. A lot of them were off of the frame and weren't being seen by the camera. So now with them in position, I can slide them around. And again, I'm just trying to follow the contours of this cliff that's in the painting. Just trying to imagine how it would be built in the 3D world. So that farthest end, I kind of wanted to lean back a little bit. Then as the faces come closer to us, we want them to kind of bulge out. I'll take the top and we'll just push it back a little bit, just because that cliff isn't totally sheer. I'll just try to make sure that the edges of the polygons encompass the painting, that edge of that cliff over there. And we have a little bit of haze on this particular layer, so need to make sure that it's there in the render and not chopped off because the geometry is not big enough. Now notice that what we're still dealing with here is a piece of geometry that's primarily flat-faced. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and show you how to tessellate it and put a little displacement on it. First of all, let's get rid of a bunch of the polygon, the faces that we know we don't need. Just going to go and select them, and all of these, since we don't see them in the camera's viewport, we're just going to delete them. Hit tessellation and crank it up a little. What this does is it gives us a lot more polygons to work with. So if we put a displace modifier over top of that tessellation, we can go in and displace all of the new tessellated polygons. I'm just going to scale this gizmo up. This yellow box is just telling us what region we want to displace. So I do want to, right now I want to displace everything visible. I'm going to create a little noise shader. Turn it down to about 5, the best guess. Call this displace, and then just copy it over into the displacement modifier stack as an instance. So now any change I make in here will be reflected in the actual displacement modifier. So right now I'm turning up the strength of the displacement, and you can see that noise is warping this piece of geometry. It's pushing and pulling every single one of those vertices. This is why we had to create more vertices. If we left the vertices count low like we had before, it would just be pushing and pulling large chunks. We want to push and pull little chunks of in this case, of rock. So that was a little too much displacement. The idea is to get a little bit of displacement to get some kind of reveal as that camera moves around, little bits of reveal all scattered throughout the face of this piece of geometry. But we don't like the way it's looking in certain parts. We don't like how the waterfalls are distorted, and we don't like the very edge of the rock cliff. So what we can do is we can limit the areas, limit the which polygons the displacement modifier is going to affect. So if I select a given group of phases with an edit mesh modifier on top of the tessellate modifier, but below the displacement modifier, this selection will guide the displacement modifier and tell it which ones we want to be affected by the displace. You can see that the displacement modifier is linked to the edit mesh below because of the squares. And so there we go, we have a displacement that's only in that red region. We'll tone it down a bit, and now we're not distorting the waterfall, nor are we distorting the very far right edge of that rock cliff. So with the appropriate amount of displacement in here, as that camera moves around just ever so subtly around the scene, we should be able to see a tiny little... Now this technique can be used on models that are a lot closer to the camera and have a lot greater impact. I've done that on many feature films where you have to create objects that are so close to the camera that they have to really, their bumpiness is really apparent. And so this is the perfect technique. It's really just a matter of how close together each one of these vertices are, which is directly related to how much we've tessellated it and how much you've displaced it. Okay, so let's get on to this closer foreground cliff. So we're going to distort it in a similar fashion, but we're not going to get into displacement. Because this rock cliff does kind of come protruding out closer to the camera, we want to make sure that we model it in such a way that we get the benefit of the 3D world. So these vertices that are closer to the camera, let's just pay attention to what's going on here. Let's try and keep the rock faces somewhat vertical, and then in the painting wherever we see some of the greenery, we'll try and make sure that it kicks back up and off to the left. This will give us a nice amount of parallax in our animation. Now, if we turn our attention to what's happening at the other end of the piece of geometry, it doesn't seem to recede back into space as much as it should be. So let's see if we can just push it back and rotate it around. Get this piece of geometry to illustrate a little closer what's really happening in the painting. Let's knock that piece of geometry up just because that tree is sticking up. We don't want that tree to fall back in the plane of the entire cliff. We kind of want it to stand out. You have to be careful when you pull one piece of geometry out like that, because you end up with little artifacts, little lines where the pixels start to smear across the geometry, and it just doesn't look natural. Got that little line there. So if you push and pull things around enough, you can find a happy solution where you can get that tree to fall where you want, and then you can, with enough effort, minimize some of the other flaws that are created in the process. There we go. Now the one last thing is on the right. The mist on the texture map was leaving the edge. So there we go. So now the geometry is big enough and sculpted in a fashion that I think will give us a nice amount of parallax. So let's render a few frames. That neighboring cliff. Now if we simply move it away from the camera, the texture map being projected from that camera map is basically going to become misaligned with the sculpt. So we have to push this piece of geometry away in such a way that it's relative to the camera. You can do that with a scale. So if you take its pivot point, you take the pivot point of the piece of geometry and you put it right exactly where the camera lies. It has to be spot on. Now if you perform a scale on this piece of geometry, as long as that pivot point is perfectly aligned with that camera, it doesn't look like it's aligned yet, then when we scale that piece of geometry in the perspective view, it won't appear to change. It will be getting farther away, but as it gets farther away, it's growing in scale. So the perspective view at one particular frame will not appear to have any change in that cliff. Throughout the animation, however, we'll be able to tell that the cliff is farther away. But this is just one trick to tweaking something that... We don't really want to push it any farther. So let's turn our attention to this little flaw here. We've got a rendering at the top of the frame and our matte painting at the bottom. So the rendering looks like we're missing a little triangular piece of vegetation on the right hand side. So I'm just going to go in and extend it with a little bit of paint. Okay, now we'll turn our attention over to the left hand side. It looks like there's a little bit of water that ends in the rendering at the top of the frame, so I'm just going to go and extend the water off to the left a little bit. Take some of the paint values and just bring them off to the left. I'll try and bring them off, extend it off to the left far enough so that I don't have to come back in here later and do it again. It's a pretty quick fix right in here, so I won't bother with it later on. Now it also looks like the top of the cliff needs some attention. In the rendering at the top of the frame, we have some softness that's visible, and I don't really think that was visible in the initial matte painting. I think that we just had that foreground cliff and that tree was hiding this area, so we didn't realize that it needed attention. So of course, now that we can render out these frames from our 3D camera, we can figure out what parts of our matte painting need to be solved. So I'm just adding some darker values to mimic some of the darker vertical rock. I'm doing this with a little hard edge brush, leaving some of the lighter values, the softer values from behind it. It'll give us a sense that there's 2 tones of rock in there. We'll just texture it up a little bit. We're almost at 200% painting here, so when we zoom out, it should look pretty convincing. So in the final matte painting, I have a layer of just mist, and that layer of mist is lining the canyon walls on the close side of the waterfalls. So I just drew a meandering line that kind of runs the contour of the canyon and extruded upwards. And this will be a piece of geometry that we can put that mist element on. Looks like I modeled it inverted, so the normals are facing the wrong way. So we'll just go in there and select them and flip them. Okay, so now the normals are facing the camera. So I also created this piece of geometry large enough so that it leaves the viewport of the camera. We don't want it to end. We don't want it to stop short, because then the mist might end abruptly. So we apply the mist to the plane and render it out. So let's load in the waterfalls. What I've done is I've done a pre-comp of the waterfalls. I've taken the matte painting and in Shake I went and composited some 3D particle renders that I made of waterfalls. So they're all right in here. It's 100 frames of particle animation. So we just load it up, we swap it out for the previous diffuse color map. But we're going to keep the same opacity map, we're not going to change that. And there's a little bit of motion, and now I think what we need to do is get on to putting a little bit of motion in the mist. Since all the mist is on this one card, I'm just going to move the card up at frame 100. So it's keyframe to frame 1, frame 100 we lift it up in Z, in the Z axis. Just a little bit, maybe like 10 feet or so. There you go. And that way when the camera flies around this environment, all the mist on this one layer will rise very slowly upward. So there we go, you can see the mist rising up. You can see the waterfalls have some particle movement. Mist geometry. That'll ensure that it rises more smoothly. And I'll just tweak the values of where it's placed. So it's rising very subtly now. It's not very noticeable at this scale, but we don't want it to be too obvious in the final render. We just want subtleties. And that should do it. So here we have our final render of the scene. We have our camera flying through our environment, making our 2D painting look like it is, like it exists in the 3D world. And we have our waterfalls moving and our mist gently rising. So that about concludes the lectures on our Palette and our 3D map painting, camera mapping techniques. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you find these techniques useful.